Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to ICA's Caribbean Climate Responsive Agriculture Forum 2022 edition. And I am already very excited because we sound like we have quite an exciting group this morning, and I am hoping that we will be having quite a good discussion. This session is for you. And I know many persons are quite interested in the topic and already have quite a few questions. And so I want you to take this opportunity to ask all your questions and to have the discussions, as we have today with us two presenters who are well versed in the area of composting. And that is your opportunity now to get added information and possibly clarification and even share some of your experiences. So my name is Nikelia Gregor-Karai. I am a technical specialist in soil and water with ICA. And I would be the person that you would be getting a lot of the emails from. And so it is a pleasure to be here and have everybody here today. So just to get a little background on the forum, it started in 2015. And the key objective of this forum is that is to raise awareness and to also share knowledge across the region. As you can see, it caters for the 13 English-speaking members of ICA, and we have Antigua and Barbuda, we have the Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, Dominica, Grenada, Guyana, Jamaica, St. Kitts and Nevis. We also have St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Suriname, and Trinidad and Tobago. So we have quite a vast expanse across the region. And so that is your opportunity to, learn from each other. And I'm sure persons probably have friends from the other countries on there. And so we want this session to be quite dynamic. We want it to be a bit interactive today. So don't think it's anything formal. So feel free to ask your questions as we go through. So the forum this year will be done as a series, and part one today will be on techniques for creating high quality compost in an effort to reduce fertilizer costs. Part two we will have on September 14th, and we will be looking at efficient low-cost irrigation and water saving techniques for increasing crop production. And the final part is where we'll be sharing some of the experiences in implementing ecosystem-based or nature-based solutions in the region. So in terms of the key objectives for this forum, in addition to raising awareness, what we also seek to do is, build a community of persons interested at a regional and national level as it relates to climate change considerations in terms of the policies, planning, and even action on the ground. But key to that is a knowledge to action. We share that knowledge with you that can be easily translated to practical action on the ground. And of course, today, we will be focusing on techniques for creating high quality compost in an effort to reduce fertilizer costs. And we have with us Mr. Bryan Smith, who is an agriculture specialist with the Jamaica Social Investment Fund. And we also have with us Mr. Mario Luis of Trinidad and Tobago, who is the co-founder of INIPSIS. And INIPSIS is International Network of Innovation Partners for Sustainable Intelligent Systems. And so I will give a bit more detail.
I've seen you for a long time. I'm glad to hear that. Okay, darling, I'll call mommy and her sir.
Okay. And so today, some of the key areas that we will be touching on is some of the techniques for creating the compost, different methods that you can utilize, also some of the materials and some of the considerations you need to take into based on the material that you are using, and also some of the methods that you can use to avoid or address some of the challenges in your composting. So today's agenda is, as I'm here, just saying a quick welcome to everybody and thank you for joining in. It is really, I'm really happy to see so many of you here with us today. And now what I will do before we go into the presentation with Mr. Smith, if all of you, I'll be launching a poll, which will show on your screen now. And the first question is, how would you rate your knowledge on composting? And how would you rate your practical skill in creating compost? So if you could just take a minute to just answer that. And then after that, we'll go directly into the presentation by Mr. Smith. So in the meantime, Bryan, if you want, you could prepare to share your screen while persons do the poll. Okay. Right. So Mr. Smith, Bryan Smith, I'm sure he prefers to be called Bryan. He is a Jamaican and he is currently the agriculture specialist with the Jamaica Social Investment Fund. His background in terms of his involvement in composting, he has done PhD research in assessing the efficacy of neem compost as well as vermicompost and vetties for the management of bacteria, fungi in crops. So he does have a lot of knowledge as it relates to composting, you know, in terms of disease suppression and that sort of area, even, you know, the whole development of compost. And so I will now take you to Mr. Bryan so that he could start the presentation.
Morning, everyone.
Okay,
Are you all hearing me today?
Hold on 1 second, Bryan. Pauline, I could see your hand up. Do you have a question? Okay, so just before we move forward, we will have the two presentations, after which we will take questions. We'll have an open dialogue. So after Mr. Smith presents and Mr. Lewis presents, we'll have that open dialogue. So I want persons to start taking down the question. You could either raise your hand and ask your question. You could type your question in the chat as well, and we will address those during the open dialogue. Thank you. Over to you, Bryan.
Good morning again, everyone. Hope everyone is having a great morning today. So myself and my colleague, Mr. Lewis Mario, will be presenting on composting. And, you know, we'll be coming from two different perspectives based on our practice and our experience in composting. And, you know, I hope as we take you along this journey that you guys will be able to, you know, benefit from some of the information and most importantly, the questions that you might ask and the answers that you will get forthcoming after. All right, so today I'll be looking at the principles of composting. So I'll touch a little bit on what is composting, and I'll go into, you know, certain important factors that you have to consider when you're making a compost, and also look at utilizing compost in terms of supplying nutrients to your soil as well as suppressing diseases. Sorry, I just saw something come up on the screen. All right. So everybody's seeing the screen and we're ready to start, ready to go?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Excellent. So we say compost is like money. It's not worth anything unless you spread it around, meaning that you can't hoard this compost or have the compost there for a long time. We have to utilize the compost for it to add value, especially to add value to our soils and to the crops that will be grown in our soils. Now, before I move forward, one of the biggest misconception that we have out there about composting is that composting is basically when we take some of our organic matter or waste material, you know, or grass or manure, we just put it together over in a corner and we see that material start to break down, and sometimes months before it actually breaks down. And we say, yes, that is a compost pile. That is my compost that I'm adding to my garden. That is the compost that I'm adding to my farm, the land that I farm on. But what I want to clarify here before we move on is the difference between decomposition, right, of organic material. And when I mention organic material now, we're speaking about all that waste that we will utilize in the composting process. versus stabilization of organic materials. So decomposition occurs naturally. If you walk in the forest or walk somewhere and we have some residue leaf or something, you're going to see it break down over time. You're going to see it turn to that dark matter over time. And so it is a natural process. However, it is a slow and uncontrolled process. There's no human intervention. There is just the human natural environmental conditions taking place and the material just breaking down. And so you cannot guarantee that the material will be free from certain pathogens or will even be in a state where it will be beneficial for you to use on your farms or in your gardens. Versus stabilization of organic materials. When we speak about stabilization of organic matter, we're speaking now about human intervention. So we pay a close attention to the pile or to the organic matter that we're decomposing or breaking down in that compost pile. We monitor it routinely. And so what happens is that you get an accelerated process in terms of the breakdown of the material, and we get higher quality material at the end with better sanitation. So there are two processes, and when we say aerobic, two processes that basically utilize oxygen to drive the breakdown of the material. And these two processes are thermophilic composting, or what we know commonly as hot composting and vermicomposting. And that's the one that involves the worms. We're not going to speak about vermicomposting today. What we're going to speak about is hot composting or thermophilic composting. And both these composts can also make byproducts or further byproducts, which are known as compost teas, or what we call liquid extracts that we can also use on our plants. So then what is composting? Composting really is the controlled, and I want you to note the word controlled, meaning that you have that ability to control aspects of the process and monitor it. So the controlled breakdown of organic materials or feedstock or waste in a predominantly aerobic, meaning oxygenated, a lot of oxygen, a lot of air environment under conditions that generate high temperatures by the microbes. So at the end, we get what is known as a stabilized product. And I'm going to be driving this term stabilize, and I'm going to be explaining it as we go along in the presentation. We also get a product that is what we call pathogen safe, meaning that we're not expecting any harmful pathogen, particularly human or even plant pathogens, to be present in that material. And we also have it being free of weed seeds, meaning that there are no more viable weed seeds in the compost at the end, in the stable product, right? And it has a dirt-like property, right, at the end. So that is what we call composting: controlled, oxygenated, high temperature, heat, stable product at the end. So why compost? There are many reasons for composting, and I'm sure when my colleague Mario goes on, he's going to speak about other reasons for why we compost. But it's a waste treatment technology, and we generate waste every day. As a matter of fact, in our countries in the Caribbean, at least over 40% of the material that we send to the landfill, or even in our farms, are organic materials, are materials that can be composted. However, we don't separate our waste. So sometimes it's a bit difficult. It also helps to prevent environmental pollution, because you can imagine when you have those things rotting like your vegetables and all of these things, it has a scent, right? Sometimes you have a little cockroach here, a little rat there. So it helps, it's a method to control or prevent or reduce environmental pollution, right? It reduces waste that we send to the landfills, and we pass the landfills, you know, in Trinidad, Beetham, you know, in Jamaica, Riverton. You know, we've passed the landfills and we see the issues that we have with our landfills in the Caribbean, right? And also it saves money. So it's a low-cost process, low operational cost, simple technology that you and I can benefit from, and others. So I'm going to be speaking briefly about setting up compost, or setting up a compost pile. Now, there are many different ways to set up a compost pile. And there are many different methods of hot composting, right? And I'm not going to get in that because my colleague is going to touch on that a bit. However, the first thing that I want in a very simple way is that we have to transfer the material. We have to look at the materials that we have around us, right? And, you know, we know that some of the material that we can use sometimes is our manure, right? Or grass, or weeds or vegetable waste and so forth and so on. So we have to transfer the material, and in its simplest form, we can use a wheelbarrow to transfer this material. We can use a pickup, a front end loader, which is a tractor, or a dump truck, and that depends on the scale of the exercise to which you're carrying out. And then after that, we look at particle size reduction, and we're going to speak about why we're reducing the particle size when we move forward. So we can use a grinder. So in the image that you're seeing above here, you're seeing some grass. I believe this was Johnson grass, right? Being grinded up, right, to a particle size that is probably less than 2 inches. And we also see below where we have some manure that would have pounded and that we're sieving, right, to pass through a particular sieve, right? So we have smaller particles. We can use a chipper for wood chips. And we can also use a lawnmower for our grasses to get them to a different particle size that we can utilize in our compost to get a better output in our product. And then the last major thing that I want to cover in mixing or setting up your compost is the mixing process. And we start very simple from a shovel in terms of our manual activities. A hay fork sometimes to turn the mixture, right? A batch mixer that probably rotates automatically, or a rotating mixing drum, or a bucket loader, right? Which is basically a tractor that is mixing, that has the front end loader. We also have the water adding system as well too, when we're mixing. So we can have a hose, we're near to a water source, or we utilize a water truck. Again, it depends on the scale. But in its simplest form, we collect and transfer the material to a flat surface. We reduce the particle size, and then we carry out our mixing activities. So there are a few critical things that we have to consider and look at when we're making our compost. And the first one that I want to discuss is the carbon to nitrogen ratio. And you might be wondering, what is carbon to nitrogen ratio? Where this whole heap of science come from? But really, in its simplest form, again, when we speak about carbon, we're speaking about the brown feedstock or the dry feedstock, right? And the availability of carbon, it depends on the size of the particle. It also depends on the lignin. So, when you have those branches that are very thick and hard to break, that dictates the availability of the carbon. And who do we want the carbon to be available to? We want the carbon to be available to the microorganisms, because they are the driving force in the composting process. And so the carbon acts as the energy source for the microbes. Similarly to us, how when we eat our yam, banana, or carbs, that acts as the energy source for us to carry out our activities or our grow food. This is the same thing that when we look at carbon and its use or its importance to microorganisms. Then we have nitrogen. We consider nitrogen to be our green feedstock or wet feedstock. And the reason why we say it's wet, because think about if you cut some Johnson grass or some grass. When it is wet or when it is green, it will be wet. And that means that it has what? Some moisture inside of it. And as soon as that moisture dries out, it becomes brown or it becomes dry, right? And so our nitrogen feedstock is what we call our green feedstock or wet feedstock. And again, its availability depends on the particle size, which is why we grind them or we break them down into smaller size before mixing. And nitrogen is linked to protein. So when we think about nitrogen, we think about now in terms of us, the meat that we eat. That is very important. We can't eat the yam and banana alone without having the meat. And it's a similar thing here. The microbes require the protein for them to grow or for them to carry out their activity. And so a balance between the carbon to nitrogen is very important for the microbial activity, for them to start to reproduce, for them to increase in population, and for them to start to do what they have to do and break down the material so that we get something that is beneficial at the end. But what we should know is that when we look at a ratio of carbon to nitrogen, in a brown material, we will have some amount of nitrogen. And in a green material, we will have our green feedstock, we will have some amount of carbon. So basically what we're saying is that there is more carbon or in the brown feedstock relative to the nitrogen. And there is more nitrogen relative to the carbon in the green feedstock. And so when we have a high C to N ratio, and always say C to N ratio, you want to think about, let's say we have some pigtail buckets or 5-gallon buckets. We're thinking about 10 parts or 20 parts of the 5-gallon buckets with brown feedstock to about 5 parts or 5 of the 5-gallon buckets of green feedstock. That is what we speak about, a ratio. That's what we're speaking about. And so when we have a high C to N ratio or carbon to nitrogen ratio, what we tend to have, that means we put it up or we pack it up with a lot of brown material. We tend to have slow decomposition. And we have limited microbial activity. And we always say the microbes are the driving force. When we have low C to N ratio now, meaning that we have a higher amount of nitrogen relative to carbon, what we start to have is that we have loss of ammonia, right? And that results in that gas, that scent that we don't really like. And ammonia, you know, it forms a part of the nutrient cycle or the nutrient within the composting system. And so when we have a lot of loss of ammonia, we tend to have loss of nutrient, particularly nitrogen. And so that is why that balance between the carbon, the energy, and the nitrogen, which is the protein, is very important for microorganisms. And then now we look at another component, which is porosity. And what is porosity? When we think about porosity, think about the pores. Think about when you go to the beach and you have a bucket of sand. And when you have these little sand grains, you have little spaces in between the sand grains. That is what we call porosity or the pore. And so when we look at the porosity, we can have either water filling the pores or air filling the pores. But there has to be a balance between the two, between water and air. We generally want to maintain moisture between 40 to 60%. And you might ask yourself, what is 40 to 60%? How I'm going to tell that? And I'm going to explain to you how you can, know if it's 40 to 60%, which is of the weight. And then we don't want too much water, because guess what? If we have too much water, we're going to have compaction. And when we have the material compacting on top of each other, we're not going to have any spaces for what? For airflow. And that is going to affect the composting process. And then if we have too little water and it is very dry, then we will have very little microbial activity. Microbes now go to nothing. And then the breakdown is going to be slow. And so one of the things that we do to ensure that we have adequate amount of water is what is known as a squeeze test. When you take up a handful of compost or the mixed material, right, that you would have combined, and when you squeeze it between your hands, if when you open your hands, it crumbles and fall apart, it tells you that the material is too dry. If when you squeeze it, you have a lot of water running out of your hands, it tells you that it is too wet. And so what you want is that when you squeeze it, it kind of forms a ball and there's a little bit of water running between your knuckles. Now, sometimes because of the nature of the material, you might have to add a lot of water because you're realizing it comes like you're mixing, we call it plant cement. You're mixing and mixing and mixing and the things still seem like it's dry. And so depending on the system that you're using and where you're setting it up, the excess water, especially because of the pores, can sometimes drain. And you get it to a point where the moisture is between 40 to 60%. The air is very important. And airflow is needed for microbial respiration. So yes, the microbes do respire. And I'm going to tell you the importance of that respiration. Just like how we respire and we breathe in and out. Take in oxygen, let out carbon dioxide, among other things. The airflow also reduces odor. Because you can imagine, just like if you have wet clothes and you pile up the wet clothes in your house, it smells bad, right? It have a little frownsy scent. Now the airflow, if you don't have airflow in the compost or pockets where air can flow, where it's not filled with a lot of water, you're gonna have some, some odors that are not pleasant to you. And then the rate of aeration, meaning that how often you turn, how often do you introduce air to the pile, that affects the temperature. And sometimes if the temperature is too high, where it can affect microorganisms, you would want to now introduce some air to kind of reduce that temperature. And so one of the methods that we use oftentimes when we have a lot of wet waste, right, and our waste that are very liquidy, is that we add bulking material. And these bulking material are represented as like sawdust or wood chips, right? Material that are not so easy to break down as well, right? Have a lot of lignin, hard to break down. These materials, because of the nature of them, they create pockets where air can flow within the compost. All right. So these two dynamics between water and air and the balance within the pores are very important to ensure that the composting process is kickstarted and it goes forward. And then another important component is temperature and pile heating. I'm sure you have heard that when we talk about hot composting, we say we're cooking the compost. And if you look here, we have a little investor system, a little 55-gallon drum that we, you can turn, without using a fork. And if you look at the thermometer, the long stem thermometer in there, you're seeing 60.7 degrees Celsius. And that means that it's very hot, or the center of the pile is very hot. And so compost, or the temperatures within compost, generally, once it's mixed properly, we have the appropriate carbon and nitrogen for the microorganisms to start to reproduce and increase in population. We have the right balance of air and water within the pores. We mix it properly and we have it in a nice little pile. The compost temperatures would increase rapidly within 24 to 48 hours, above 45 degrees Celsius. And depending on the height of the pile or how big the pile is, this can sometimes go close to even 100 degrees Celsius. And that is in the initial stage of the composting. And so what is happening there is that the microbes are respiring. And a byproduct of respiration is heat. You ever realize that when you're in a room together with a lot of persons, no AC, you start to feel hot? That is because you're respiring and your body is giving off that heat. And so similarly, when these microbes now build up in population and they start to act and eat the material and break it down and all of these things, they are respiring and they are producing heat. And this heat is cooking the compost pile and is also serving a very important function in terms of denaturing the weed seeds and also reducing the pathogen level to a threshold that is no longer harmful, right? And so generally we want to have temperatures above 45 degrees Celsius for continuously, depending on the pile size, for at least 5 consecutive days. And even longer again, depending on the pile size and the type of material that you're composting. Also, compost can self-insulate. So because you're stocking everything on top of each other, just as if you're stocking, if a lot of you in the room, there's gonna be that insulation of heat. So because of the materials stocked on top of each other, you can have that sustained temperature. And as pile temperature decreases, which it will, and I'll explain later on, the breakdown also decreases. Because guess what's happening now? The microbes don't have enough food now, And so the microbial population starts to reduce a little bit. And so after the reduction in the microbial population, they also start to feed less. And so the temperature and the respiration and the heat also decreases. And so temperature is affected by the physical and biological composition of the compost. So how the shape of the material, the biology of the material, the availability of nutrients. We speak about carbon and nitrogen, the level of moisture, the structure of the pile. And we say the structure of the pile, we're speaking about the bulk density, the particle size. Because you see, if the particle size is smaller, it means that the microbe can act on it. Just think about when you're eating something or giving something to a baby. If the food is crushed or smaller, it is easy to digest, it is easy to consume. And similarly, when the material that you're breaking down is a little bit smaller, not too small that it does form a flat compaction, but small enough where the microbes can actually act on the surface and eat it and break it down. Also affected by the rate of aeration, the size of the pile, and most importantly, the surrounding environment. So if it's windy, if it is rainy, it will also affect the temperature. Another important thing to consider is pH. And somebody might ask, what is pH? pH is simple, how acidic or how basic something is, how alkaline something is. And I put this little chart on the left-hand side to show you some little household things that you can relate to being alkaline or being acidic. So at the acidic level, you realize that lime juice and vinegar are very acidic. Grapefruit juice, coffee is a bit acidic. But then now when we move now to, being alkaline, we start to look at the baking soda being alkaline, the bleach being alkaline and stuff like that, right? And we also have neutral, which is at 7, which means that, it's neither alkaline or acidic. And so the pH literally affects, you ever hear them tell you drink alkaline water, not acidic water? Because it affects us similarly. The pH affects microbial activity. And
but I advertise on a piece of rope. Get me.
And so usually pH rises and then falls, right? So in the beginning, when you start off the composting process, the pH is going to increase and then it's going to fall. And so what we generally want is a pH between 5.5 and 8.5 to start off with. And you see this little machine that you're seeing a picture of, that is a pH meter. This might be a little complex one, but you have very simple ones, very reasonable ones that you can get on Amazon for about $40, $30 that can do the same thing and tell you the range of your pH, how acidic or how basic something is. Now, if you're starting off with materials that are very acidic, feedstocks that are very acidic, such as vegetable waste, sometimes you might want to add liming products. And liming products like wood ash, because wood ash is generally a bit alkaline to kind of balance off the pH so that you get that nice kickstart in your compost. And what will happen is that if your pH is too acidic, meaning that it's down here like the lemon juice and the vinegar, it can affect the microorganisms and they will die. No activity, and you'll have that scent occurring in the compost pile. And also, you remember we spoke about ammonia and that gas and how it affects nitrogen. If the pH is too high, we will have a lot of ammonia and that scent occurring, and we'll lose a lot of the nitrogen and the nutrition or the nutritive value of the compost, right? And we don't want that. And then we have something called soluble salt content. Think about the table salt that you normally have, but in this case, the soluble salt would be things like your magnesium, your potassium, your calcium, all of these nutrients that the plant will generally use come together. And so generally, the soluble salt content is reported in what we call decisiemens per meter, but don't worry about that. But in this range or in this value, just like how we say we are 5 feet, this is the unit that is used to measure salt or the soluble salt content. And generally, in a finished compost, because of the type of material that you start with, such as manure and all of these things, you might have a EC or a soluble salt content of 5 to 15 decisiemens per meter. So within that 5 to 15, what we know is that that is very high salt. And you can imagine when you eat some meat or you eat some food and it's very salty, you want some water, or your tongue is scorched. And similarly, we see here, when you look at these plants here, that would have been exposed to high salt compost. You see how they're melting away and sometimes burning, right? And so we want our salt to be less than 5. And that is preferred when we're going into crop production. And even when we're doing seedlings, we want it to be even lower, right? And that is one of the considerations or the things you have to think about when you're doing hot composting. You have to monitor, or you probably have to mix it with like some pro mix or some salt, because the salt content might be a bit high. Or you might have to consider the material that you're mixing because of the how salty these materials are generally. And some of these salts are essential to plant nutrients, and they affect seed germination, they affect plant growth, such as the root and the shoot growth. And here we have a little machine called an EC meter that can measure salt. And similarly, you can get this on Amazon for a very reasonable cost to monitor your salt, right? Especially if you're gonna have an end use for your compost. And we've been talking about microorganisms and the importance of microbes in the composting process. And one of the material that really provides these microbes, that we call our seeding material, we'll call it seed because it just gives a lot of microbes, is our manure. Our manure naturally gives a lot of microbes to kickstart the composting process. And that is why it's such a nice substrate to use, and also a difficult substrate sometimes if you don't know what you're doing. And so the microbes, generally we're looking at, this is a bacteria. So this is many bacteria together on a plate, on a nutrient plate with some nutrient growing. And here we see some fungi on the plate as well growing. And you have other microorganisms that are involved in the composting process. But these two help to break down. They are the ones that help to break down the material, and very important in the process. And so they need the nutrients such as the carbon and the nitrogen that we spoke about, right? For the energy and the protein to carry out the activity. They need oxygen, so they need the porosity. Remember, we're speaking about the porosity and the pores. They need the air to breathe, to carry out respiration so that they can live. You need to manage temperature, because if it's too high, it can affect them from functioning. So that is why sometimes you have to turn your pile. And you also need the moisture, because the moisture helps them to, to move and to carry out certain activities. And most importantly, time. Because over time, these microbes will increase in population, increase in their activity. And so that is why time is very important in the composting process. And so really and truly what we just discussed a while ago is our nutrients, carbon and nitrogen. And we have target range, 20 to 1, 40 to 1. What does that mean? In my layman term, I love to say 3 parts of brown, 3 to 5 parts of brown to 1 part of green. And remember, we say our browns are our carbon. When we have that blend generally, and we say 3 parts, you're gonna obviously scale up. It means if I have 3 pigtail buckets, I use 3 pigtail buckets of my brown to 1 pigtail bucket of my green. And remember, I said that the brown will have a little bit of nitrogen in it, you know, and the green will have a little bit of carbon. So that is why you don't necessarily have this ratio or when you're when you're mixing. But if you're supposed to test the material, this is the ratio generally that they're saying that composting will occur in. But we're not saying that composting cannot occur outside of these limits, because it can and it has. The moisture content we spoke about and all of these other things we spoke about. What is bulk density? Bulk density is really when we look at the mass. So the weight of something in the bucket. If we put a bunch of leaf in a bucket, it's going to be light versus if we put soil in the bucket. And so that is what we mentioned in terms of bulk density, the weight of something in the volume, in the bucket, the 5-gallon bucket. And what we're saying is that generally when we mix our compost and we have our mix, if we take up that bucket and we weigh it on a scale, it should be less than 25 pounds, right? The material inside of it, for us to have an idea as a rule of thumb that, listen, well, bulk density is okay. We're not going to have too much compaction without no air, no pore space for air to flow, etc. And so really, when we look at the composting process, what we're seeing is that we're inputting some raw organic matter, feedstock, waste. We have some nutrients in that organic matter as well. We add our water. We have our microorganisms coming from our organic matter, such as our compost. And then when we mix everything based on what we would have said, and we have oxygen and in the air, in the pore spaces, etc., we start to have what? Water being lost. We start to have heat because the microbes, you know, producing heat. And through the respiration, we have carbon dioxide being released. And at the end of the process, what we have is stable. So we'll come back to that word stable, stable organic matter, stable compost that still have nutrients, but these nutrients now are more available.
Oh, and sister coming back.
And when we say that the nutrients are more available to the plants, think about it this way. When you have the organic matter, the waste, that waste really and truly, the nutrient lock inside of the tissue. It lock inside, the plant can't access it. The plant can only access available forms. And so what the microbes do for you in the composting process is that they convert that nutrient that the plant can't access to a form that the plants can access. So the minerals over here are more accessible by the plants versus over here when we start. Then we have some water and we have more beneficial microbes in the stable organic matter.
Hi, Brian. If we could start wrapping up a bit.
Yes, ma'am, no problem.
Thank you.
And so when we look now right here, what we're seeing is that we can simply monitor the composting process. How? Temperature is the simplest way. At the beginning, the temperature rises, and then afterwards it drops down. Right? And therefore, when it starts to drop down, that is when our compost is becoming stable or mature. And now I'll give you the answer. What is stability? Stability is when the compost or the decomposition has slowed. So meaning that the microorganisms don't have much more food or available food. So them kind of slow down in terms of how much breakdown they're doing. Right? And then now the mature compost, right, would be now that it really has decomposed. More plant nutrients are available. And most importantly, harmful substances would have been reduced, right? And so that, when we talk about maturity, we generally do what is known as a germination assessment. You see some mixture, some solution, you see the plants growing, and you also see the seedlings growing in the compost. That is what you use to determine how mature your compost is. But stability, you would realize that your temperature would have fallen. And so you see it here, the difference when we start and when we end. And we also can use that compost to make compost tea, which is basically a liquid extract. Sometimes we can't travel with that bulky compost. Sometimes we don't have enough, but we can put it in, ferment it into some water, and this will have some nutrients and beneficial organisms that you can use. And it can be used for disease suppression and so forth. And so depending on how mature your compost is, you have different uses for your compost. And so I'll end right there, and I will turn over to my colleague, Mario, for him to continue with his presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you, Brian. A lot of information there. I do hope everyone is taking that in and noting down the questions after Mario will have presented. So we'll go straight into our next presenter, who is Mario Luis, and he is a native of Trinidad and Tobago, and he is the co-founder of INIPSIS, which is the International Network of Innovative Partners for Sustainable Intelligent Systems. And they specialize in the design and implementation of zero waste composting systems for agriculture, food and beverage sector, and households. He also practices agroforestry, which includes soil health management, biodiversity conservation, and food production system. And so Mario has had a lot of practical experience, both on the household level up to the commercial level, and he will be sharing some of that with you now. Mario, over to you.
Hello.
Yes, I could hear you clearly.
Okay, I want to share the screen, please. Good day, everyone.
Yes, you can go ahead and share.
Okay. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased for the turnout today. So I'll quickly go into the presentation. I'll share some of my personal experiences, challenges, and learning outcomes, and I hope it will be beneficial to everyone. So I will start with household. I sure you all produce a lot of waste in your house, food waste especially, and you most likely will put it into the bin and it ends up in the landfill. So I decided to do some research into that area and figure out if there's a way to solve that problem. And I came upon several solutions, more so high-tech solutions, which I would share with you, right? So the first one is, it's called a GGO2 universal composting system, which you can easily install in your kitchen or in a garage area. And all it requires is a space to add a hose for the exhaust pipe, and you just feed it. This system works basically with very similar description that Brian gave you about setting up a pile. However, it requires some bioengineering, which has to do with the extraction of a microbe from a volcanic environment, which was engineered into sawdust, and it can only function once it's in that vessel system and it's fed with organic waste material, and the conditions that Brian just described, the moisture, the heat, and the air, all comes alive with the microbe. The fascinating thing about this technology, within 24 hours to 48 hours, it transformed the waste material into this image you see here, which is like a pulverized material, what you call raw compost. And that raw compost has nutrient value, but it also has a high level of salt. So you can't use it immediately as part of your input for your gardening or crop production. So which means you have to have some understanding of the material and how to further develop the material, right? So what it requires is for you to use it as part of a composting method, which I would go into further with the thermophilic composting.
Sorry a bit, Mario. Persons are having a bit of a challenge hearing you. If you could speak a little louder, please. Thank you.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, so machine, the composter, it processes the material similar to how Bryan described a compost pile. The difference is that it's designed using a microbe that was embedded into sawdust, which was extracted from a volcanic environment. For the microbes to come alive, you need to feed it with the organic waste material, primarily food waste, any type of food waste. Once it's fed with the food waste, the machine has a what you would call a arm or auger that turns, similar how you would turn a compost pile, and that starts to accelerate the activity of the microbe by introducing the oxygen, the moisture control, along with the time, as Bryan mentioned. So between 24 hours to 48 hours, you can have what you would call a raw compost material. It's the challenge with the raw compost material is that we're going to have high salt level because the food we eat, we put salt in the food, right? So there's the natural salt in the plant, but there's added salt based on we need to get taste and what have you. So that salt level is quite extreme. So what has to happen, the material has to go through another treatment process, which I'll discuss further along the line. Or if you have the experience, you will know how to use the ratio with the raw compost along with other biomass material, along with soil, and you may be able to apply it according to the end use. This is another system. It's a bin system, which we introduced to a client, the Hilton Hotel, as a way to manage their their waste material during the hotel operation hours, which has a lot of drawback because of the sanitary guidelines and security and what have you. So we proposed to them, what if we bring bins and just leave it there for you, and all you need to do is just fill the bins and we will take them away, do the composting, and at the end, over a period of time, we would return with compost material. So we had a schedule worked out. Every week we'll deliver the bins, they will fill the bins, we'll collect the bins. The fascinating thing about this bin, unlike other waste bin, is that it was designed primarily for food waste. So there's a special lid that has an area that holds what they call a biofilter. And it's a natural biofilter that collects or absorbs the sulfur smell and then convert it into carbon dioxide. So in this biofilter, there are enzymes that feed on the smell and then transform that into the carbon dioxide. So this is an example of what it looks like. So this is the lid on your left, and this lid has these tablets that are made from, would you believe, coconut coir, and it also embeds these microbes, right? So after a period of time doing this service for the Hilton, we collected data because one of our most important aspects of our work is collecting data, because that's the best way we can demonstrate to companies and individuals the benefit of what we're doing, besides diverting the waste from the landfill or making it easier for you to manage your waste. So just within 2-month period, because Hilton Hotel has over 300 rooms, they have a low period and a high period. So the high period means most times a carnival and Christmas time. So over a period of 2 months, we collect as a pilot, we collected over 15,000 pounds of waste, and none of it, I promise you this, none of it went to the landfill. We collect all of it and took it to our site, and we went through the composting process. At the same time, we use a compost calculator that deals with emissions, and we were able to measure what the emissions were in terms of what we were able to reduce. And as you can see, it's over 170,000 pounds of CO2 emission that was saved. At the same time, we were able to measure how much compost we get from what we produce with a factor 20% loss based on reduction. And this is the amount that we were over 10,000 pounds what we were able to produce. Now, at the same time doing food waste, I became interested in farmers doing their own composting or their own challenges with regards to managing manure and their crop waste. And when they're cleaning their land, or when they're pruning, or when they're doing different types of preparations or harvesting and what have you. So I had several conversations with different livestock farmers and different crop producers. And I learned that, yes, they do have a problem. Although they would stockpile the manure, they think, well, you know, yeah, it's the material that they can sell or material that they can use to themselves. So I did some research in manure as a waste management challenge, and I came across some interesting findings that not much discussion has been done in this part of the world. And one of the main things that I learned is that because of the treatment or the rearing of the animals, most farmers depend on medicine and antibiotics, these type of things. And I was surprised to find out that when animals are administered with these different medicines and antibiotics, the digestive system doesn't really digest everything. In fact, the digestive system only, based on literature that I read, only digests about 20 or 30% of the antibiotics, and the rest go out into the manure. And I thought that was a big concern. I realized it's an opportunity for me to address, while at the same time when the crop producers and they use their chemicals, fertilizers, or they would just have a large amount of waste, bio-waste material stockpile on their land and not doing anything, and it becomes a kind of hazard as well. So I decided that, okay, let me look into a scenario with a farmer and his wife, because most smallholding farming communities are made up mainly of a husband and a wife, and the husband is over 50 years old, and he is so consumed with the amount of work he has to do. How come he can, what would be possible for him now to take on another discipline such as composting? So I would try to illustrate some practical steps that you could look into and figure out how best you can design your own system that you're able to manage with your limited resources and time. So on the left, you see a diagram like a pie chart of different shapes and things that more or less represent the different materials that one would have on their site. So you have to do an audit of what you have on your site as a farmer, right? So as a farmer, you will see if you have flowers, trees, fruits, and of course, livestock and so on. And you have to determine which one produces the most waste. So you have to decide, okay, if that produces the most waste, as Bryan mentioned, is it carbon or is it nitrogen? Is it wet or is it dry? So you have to figure out, okay, if that is, for example, wet as in manure, how you would best treat with it as a composting ingredient. And on the right, I will show you a compost pile. In terms of the size is very important because it depends on the material types, the quantity of the material, the particle size, as Bryan mentioned, and of course the homogeneous treatment of the material before the pile is made up. So you have to understand these different variables. So a lot of observation is required in light of designing a compost pile that functions really well. And it's not going to happen at the first time. It's something you have to continuously do it. But some of the indicators you can look for if your pile is functioning healthy is pay attention to the what you call the mycelium that you would see. You would see some weird white looking thing on your pile, and you might think that is a disease or some kind of strange thing. That is a very good indicator that the pile is healthy. If you don't see that, you know your pile isn't healthy. Another thing you look for, or you try to figure out, is if there's a nice little earthy smell that's happening during the process, as Bryan described, a sweet smell, that indicates that your pile is healthy. But if the smell isn't sweet and it smells like socks, then you know that's a problem. And of course, the moisture of the pile in terms of you taking it and you touching it, because a lot of thing about the most important thing for me about composting is touching, feeling, smelling, looking. Don't stand from a distance and measure and think everything is working, because it's not going to work like that. You have to engage the material. Now, if a farmer say, yes, I want to do it, but what is the benefit besides me managing the waste or I getting something for myself? What if I can turn this into some kind of business model? And I have here a basic formula that we developed over time by collecting data, measuring productivity, and all the other requirements to make a compost at the end. So of course, you would want to know how much you could pay yourself an hour. What does the daily rate look like? And of course, you have to have measuring systems so you can be as accurate as possible when you're building the compost pile. And at the end, you get the end product that you want. And it all depends on the type of material. So I'm not going to get into the material, but I'm providing you with a baseline kind of thought about whatever material you're working with, this is something to help guide you. So we work with a wheelbarrow, and we know with the wheelbarrow, the measurements will be accurate. So we say 1 wheelbarrow full of material is 3 cubic feet. Okay, we want to build a pile, and as I said, the pile has to be a certain size, and we realize to get that size, we need 20 barrels of the material, and this is the material combined as in organic, nitrogen and carbon material. So I can't differentiate the ratio for you because it all depends on what it is you're working with, right? So with the 20 barrels, you get 60 cubic feet, which would give you 1 pile. With that 1 pile now, you can then calculate how much you could sell 1 cubic foot for, with a loss factor between 20 and 50%. Now I'd say 20 and 50%, it could be more than 50% because it depends on it. There's this big craze of using sargassum seaweed as a compost material. And I could tell you, you're quite surprised how that thing shrinks when you compost it. You could bring a whole truck through and it could end up like a pickup. So you have to understand, depending on the type of material you're using, there's a loss factor. And as Bryan mentioned earlier, you have to consider bulking agents. And when that comes into play, the end product may change accordingly with the nutrient value and these type of things. So the end product has to go through several investigations. The end product has to first look like or feel like soil. So it's not actually soil, but it looks like, it feels like soil. After the period of time, which is like 3 months for maturity, or if you are able to, you can use it before 3 months, but you have to know what you're applying it to and for, and I can discuss that later, right? But the end product has to look like, feel like soil, has to have a certain kind of, I don't know, smell, but not really. It just needs to feel comfortable in your hand, not sticking, not feeling, that, it makes you squinge or what have you. It has to feel and look like soil. So that's one indicator that the material has some quality about it. with regards to arriving at that quality, which I didn't mention, is that you have to keep the compost covered all the time, or your composting process covered all the time. So like Bryan had mentioned, the weed seeds, these things through the air or atmosphere, in some way or the other, they find themselves in the compost pile. So you have to keep it covered at all times, all the way to the end. You have to make sure that the environment that your piles are located is not exposed to extreme sun, and is not exposed to water draining off from some part of your building, or when rainfall, it's in a sink, and then all the water goes there. All of that will really make the material at the end become less and less effective. So you'll be washing away nutrients. The weed seeds are going to be there, so you're going to just be transplanting it onto your land or your garden, and then you have to hire a gardener, you have to do more cutting. So these are the things you have to really discipline yourself about to get the end product. The other thing is the testing. So basically, Bryan had highlighted it. I'll just go through it quickly. You must test the compost at the end to see if it is effective in terms of, does the seed germinate within 3 days, 6 days, a week, depending on what seed it is. Does the plant look stable, like strong stem, nice green leaves? Does the compost in itself still looks very rich and black, and there's still moisture in there, and not too wet, not too dry? So these are the observations you make to record if the compost is working really well. Then you can take that plant now over a period of time and put it into the soil and see how it functions in terms of its health. See if any fruit happen. So this is over a period of time, 3 months or so. And then you excavate the plant. You take the entire plant out of the ground to see the root mass. If at all the root mass is really well, if at all the root mass are going in the directions it need to go, and the quality of the stems, the branches, and these type of things, right? So another thing I look for, the other thing I look for is the earthworms and the water holding capacity. So every time I'm doing composting, I always think about the soil first. I don't think about the plants. I think about soil. I think about the soil all the time. The plants is not my first thought. It's what I need to do for or with the soil. How best I can apply what I'm doing that will enhance the soil, and at the same time provide the nutrient value and the necessities of the plant. So you must know your soil. You must know what soil you're working with. What's the problem with the soil? What's the challenge with the soil? You have to do some work on that. So you have to dig up your soil, see how difficult it is for the tool to go into the soil, see if the soil holds too much water. You have to get familiar with your soil. So with the water holding capacity, you have to look at how much moisture remains in the compost, or remain in the area where you put your compost, as well as how much water is being drained as well. These are important things that you have to understand with compost. You want moisture, you want water, you don't want too much, you don't want too little, but you want enough. And of course, with all of these things you're doing, you're tackling the whole question around CO2 emissions with regards to the bigger picture, climate change and what's happening. So the takeaway for me, I hope you all will agree, is that you must know a lot about your material in terms of how much liquid or moisture it has. So to come to focus on your nitrogen and carbon. You also have to know how much moisture or liquid is in your composting system that you designed for building your piles and processing. Along with that, you have to understand, if there's not enough air, the microbes wouldn't heat up. Along with, if you don't have the proper mix with the nitrogen and the dry and the wet, the microbes will become docile and they wouldn't populate. And of course, everything you're doing with compost requires time. So you have to have time to prepare the material, time to set up the pile, time for processing, time for recording and measuring, and time for maturing and application. And most of all, invest in a tool as a thermometer to test the temperature level so you know if your pile is healthy. Like I said earlier, you look at the microbe, the mycelium or the fungus or anything, but the more importantly, you have to look at you have to measure the temperature, which Bryan had highlighted earlier, between 55 and 65 degrees Celsius over a period of 3 days consecutively. And then you can then turn your pile once per week after that. You don't have to turn your pile every 3 days. This is not necessary. You need to let the pile go through its natural system as much as possible. And then you come in and then you add the turning to give the aeration for the microbes. And what happened as time go along, as the compost heats up, it has to go through the mesophilic cycle, which the microbes begins to die out and it's cooling down, but another type of microbes come in there that would continue finishing the work towards destabilizing in the compost, which you would have to use at the end. And that's me. Thank you. I hope I offer some information that's quite useful.
Okay, thank you very much, Mario, and thank you, Bryan. So now we are going to move into the open dialogue, and I do hope persons have recorded their questions. You have the option to type your question in the chat, or you could raise your hand and ask your question, unmute your mic and ask your question. A lot of information was shared. I'm sure a lot of you do compost and you do have some experiences there. So now the floor is open for your questions.
Hi, good morning.
Yes, good morning, Dylan.
All right, so my name is Dylan Williams from Dominica. I represent the Dominica Organic Agriculture Movement. I've been an organic farmer for about 15 years. So I'm quite familiar with the topic this morning. Very delighted to be part of it and, you know, to join the experience with everybody here from all the other Caribbean islands. I just have two small questions, really. One, I know that a lot of people have questions concerning the sargassum, because sargassum, you know, as you know, it's well, worldwide thing all over the Caribbean. It's, you know, all over the beaches and whatnot. People want to know how to go about it. And, you know, there's a lot of contradicting, you know, stories out there about it, whether, you know, it's okay to use because of the levels of arsenic and the salt content and whatnot. So I just want you guys to just touch on arsenic in terms of sargassum, just for about 2 minutes, please, just to kind of clear any air on it. And also, in the very beginning, he mentioned in terms of the quality difference between compost that is naturally decomposed, like for example, leaves decomposing under the forest, and something which is controlled. I just wanted to touch on that again as to, you know, the significant difference then, in other words, because in my experience, I've had great results in both controlled and in decomposed, naturally decomposed material in terms of, you know, nature and acts of God, you know, like just, you know, picking it up or leaving piles to rot by itself and so on and so forth. Like I've seen significant, you know, results from using, you know, naturally decomposed material. So just wanted to touch on that a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you, Dylan. Bryan or Mario, any of you want to take this question?
All right, morning again, everyone. So I'll take the second question that was asked in terms of natural decomposition versus composting and the differences. I do agree with you that you can get good result from natural decomposition, because really and truly, composting is just a formulated technology that mimics what would normally happen in nature. I think the difference is when you're speaking about nature and an organic material in a forest setting, or depending on the type of waste that you're dealing with, you might have a case where it is not as detrimental, or it doesn't have so much toxins, or, you know, in terms of pathogens, depending on where you get your waste stream from. And so in that natural decomposition process, that also takes a longer period of time because of the lack of control. You can get materials that are safe to use. But I think what we should highlight or should see as the difference between natural decomposition and composting is that the latter process, which is composting, it's controlled. And so you're able to manage a larger variety of waste, right? You're able to get a stabilized product, particularly in investor systems like drums, at a much quicker rate in comparison to natural decomposition. So if we're thinking along the business line, if we're thinking along throughput to meet demand or to cut fertilizer cost, that is where now the advantage would be in terms of composting versus a natural decomposition process. But compost definitely borrows from the natural decomposition process with just tweaks in terms of the activities or the what needs to be done so that you can get something that is controlled in a shorter and safer to use in a shorter duration of time. Hope I answered your question there.
Sure, you did. Thank you very much for that. And Sagasam now.
Thanks, Brian. Who wants to take the Sagasam question?
Well, I'll take an attempt at it because I also was investigating sargassum as a feedstock. And yes, there are many different views and concerns about it. And there are research currently being done and books being published on it. But what I do know so far is that yes, you can use sargassum as a feedstock for composting, but it also has to do with the end use. So I wouldn't be so excited to think that it's something I could replace immediately for your current inputs that you would use on your farm. I think some level of experimentation would need to be done for the end user. What I can say is that the logistics around composting sargassum is the most difficult aspect because it washes up into the seafloor, and you now need to figure out a way how to design a system to harvest it and process it and then make the end product. What I would normally suggest is if there's a collective that can work together along with the government agency and design a system that focuses a lot, not just on the end product, but the logistics of collecting the sargassum. So things like having GPS, things like having people patrol and as observers, different equipment and what have you, will help with the logistics with the sargassum. Now, once that is figured out, then you now have a proper setup, land space and what have you, and other ingredients to add with the sargassum, because sargassum shrinks tremendously after you go through its dehydration process. And you'll be quite disappointed to see what you would end up with after you go through that process. So what I can say is that you can do experiments with it with different plants, but I wouldn't start with typical vegetable plants and see what you get from it. So I don't have the experience to tell you it works really well, but I do know it requires more investigation.
Okay, thank you. Just so we do have a lot of questions in the chat, and we do have quite a number of persons are waiting to ask their question. So if we could have the questions very direct, and so we could get a quick explanation for them so that we can at least try to answer majority of the questions. I will take George's question and then I will read one of the questions from the chat. Go ahead, George.
Thank you very much. Good morning. This is George. I'm an agronomist with Cardi. I work from the Belize office. Interesting presentation. I like the information from both Brian and Mario. What you guys have not spoken about, and that is what my question is, is that of the making of bokashi. It is the anaerobic method of fermenting waste and of course using the microorganisms brand to catalyze the action and make it a lot faster, unlike the aerobic breakdown, like Bryan explained, is part of the natural process, but we stimulate it by adding greens and browns to make our compost material. So the question basically is the making of bokashi a lot maybe cheaper or easier? For sure, it says it's a lot shorter in time, but how would you juxtapose it in terms of the use of the material and the composition of it, making it, and the cost? Of course, you have to have sealed bins, but is it more economical to use on a small scale basis? Because our work basically is for small scale farmers. And so my question is, how would you juxtapose using or making the bokashi instead of that of normal compost? Thank you very much. But yes, again, interesting presentations and quite informative. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. Mario, you want to take this one? Or Bryan?
Well, I can start with the question. Yes, you are right. We didn't touch on bokashi because first and foremost, I thought bokashi would require inputs that I would have to buy from outside of Trinidad. And most of the investigation and research we do, we're looking at how we can use everything 100% locally accessible. So bokashi was not really something I was interested in, although I know people use it. But if somebody's willing to invest in it, I think, yeah, they could try it. But I really don't have much experience using the bokashi.
Okay, thanks, Mario. So I will read some of the questions from the chat. Mr. Smith spoke about seedless compost. So the question, does that mean there are periods of harvesting grass to avoid seeds? And also, how do you test for pile porosity?
All right. So seedless compost, right? So what we say when we mention seedless compost, and before I start, I want to touch on the sarcasm because it's, something that's a little bit topical. And what I wanted to mention is that for many different types of seaweeds that wash up on our shores, and one of the things that the research has shown is that these seaweeds contain heavy metals, one of which is arsenic. And what we know about plants is that they fight to accumulate, means that they accumulate some of these nutrients within their tissues. And so they can accumulate some of these heavy metals that can also be detrimental, especially if we're gonna, consume. And when we look at, for example, cocoa, we know that cadmium, which is also in the seaweed, can also affect the quality of fine flavored cocoa for chocolate. So I just wanted to put that out there. As regards the seed, generally when we have a compost, it doesn't mean that we won't have seed mixed inside of the compost. But what will happen is that you might have regrowth of seed after you have that cooling or stable process. You might see 1 and 2 seeds germinating. But because of that sustained temperature heat, what it really does is that it denatures the seeds at the end of the process, or most of them, thereby reducing, germination of weed seeds in the finished product. So that's why managing and temperature is very important. Also, yes, if you have your grass and it is seeding, you take your seeded grass, and that is why the compost process assists in terms of denaturing. But if you can cut your grass, your Johnson grass, your razor grass before it starts to seed, that also, can prove beneficial in terms of reducing the amount of seeds that will be in the compost at the end, right? And also reduce the fact that if the process was not efficient enough to denature the seeds, that you won't have regrowth at the end of it. As it regards porosity, in terms of pore space, generally it's, as I said, we use the squeeze test to really look at moisture, and when that drains, we'll have a balance of water to air. But from a more complex standpoint, you generally put it in like a core or a cup that is open at the top and the bottom. And basically you look at allow it to drain out, or the water to drain out. And some other scientific methods that you would also use to measure the air versus the water. So right there and then you can know, if you put it in the oven, for example, what the moisture content would be. And and also the rate at which the water drains will give you an indication of the porosity as well too.
Okay, thank you, Brian. So I will now ask St. Vincent to go ahead with the question. St. Vincent, are you there? Okay, so once you're ready, they'll come on. Lauren, you could go ahead with your question.
Yes, please. Good morning, a pleasant good morning to all. I really appreciate these two presenters and the wealth of information that I've obtained this morning on composting. At first, when I submitted, I put medium for the first answer, but I think I had to go back to low because I thought I knew about composting and I really didn't. Because I tried that in my backyard. I'm part of the backyard gardening initiative in Grenada. And I tried it in my backyard and I noticed there was a smell. And I was wondering why the smell. And no, I get all my clear information. My only problem is that I was taking notes and I got lost. And that wealth of information, I think next time maybe we can do Mr. Smith 10 to 12 so that we can go into more details. But all along, I think it is a very good session and I've benefited a lot from it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lauren. Before we take another question, I will ask Chani to come in a bit to talk just briefly on the Sagas and also the Bokashi.
Hi, colleagues. Good day. I just wanted to weigh in a little bit on the discussion about the Sargassum and also the Bokashi. The first thing I want to leave everybody with is that any material that you are going to compost with, you have to be responsible with it. What I mean by that is that it really goes through the same scrutiny as Sargassum should. So for example, Sargassum is not the only material that would have a source problem or source challenge as it relates to salt and also some other things that you may have to treat with. Brian mentioned the issue of some of the manure and some types of manure. In terms of Sargassum, and similar to what the process they use for the coconut coir, there's a retting procedure that is normally used there and that is advisable, where essentially, if you can, and depending on the scale that you're doing it, I saw some comments there, you actually soak the Sargassum in fresh water for at least a day or 3 days. And then after you have done that, you throw away that water and use the Sargassum. Again, it depends on what scale and what are the quantities. Alternately, just like the manure, you could allow it to actually start to decompose at a certain stage, ensure that a lot of water passes through it. You could even put it on what you call, for example, as I saw in the comments, a kind of a filter process where you have it stacked on things like sand, gravels, etc. So as the rain hits it and it decomposes, a lot of the soil, the salt actually filters through that filter, and then you use it for composting. But the issue of the salt is a real thing, and it is not just for Sargassum. Imagine things that are not even in the water, for example, some of the crops and some of the manure. In tropical composting, you do have an issue with that manure, that high salt buildup. And so that is a real issue, in addition to the possible profiles of the heavy metals in not only the Sargassum, but generally should be a concern for any material that you are taking from the sea, particularly large amounts of fish waste as well. And depending on where you're actually taking it, how close it is to an industrial zone. And so these are the things, persons, I think that we have to be very clear about. Composting is not just any. We have to think particularly of the material there. So that's on that particular topic. On the issue of the Bokashi, and definitely there's so much information on composting, and the intention, we cannot possibly go through all of the material there in terms of all the types of composting. But I will also caution that people also be a little bit more discerning and critical of the information that you get online, particularly as it relates to how you're going to implement it. In terms of the Bokashi could be an excellent method there, but persons must generally, and we could perhaps have a next session where we talk about anaerobic composting here, but persons must also be very concerned, or persons must be educated about it. meaning that in the aerobic, one of the advantages it has over the aerobic is that it tends to have a greater preservation or conservation of nutrients. What that means is that, believe it or not, when you're composting, some of the nutrients are lost through the process, particularly the nitrogen, specifically the nitrate. What the fermentation does is that it keeps most of that nutrient, so you're likely to get, with anaerobic composting, the bokashi method, an end product that is higher in nutrients than with the hot composting that was spoken about. The thing about it is that you're also likely, if it is not done properly, or if you're not too aware of it, to develop some phytochemicals, phytotoxic chemicals, or chemicals that might be toxic to the plants and also toxic to your health. Again, it can be done on a larger, small scale, but it requires a greater sense of knowledge and management as it relates to what can be done and the end use of it. So I just wanted to put that out there for persons. I see somebody put something about pesticides. That is also something you have to be aware of in the source material when you are taking it in. Thank you.
Thank you, Chani. For those who may not know, Dr. St. Martin is an international specialist in soil and water with ICA as well. So I will take a question from the chat. How often do you have to do tests of the pile as it relates to added material? And also the question dealing with pathogens in compost, apart from using temperature, how can we ensure that compost do not have harmful pathogen that is, well, harmful to both humans and the plants themselves? Any of you want to take this? Okay, go ahead, Brian.
Right, so I'll speak about the pathogen. Possibly Mario can speak about the addition of materials. As Dr. St. Martin was mentioning a while ago, the source of our material, we must always be concerned about where we get our materials from, our organic materials or waste materials. And so we are aware that, for example, in manures, you can have pathogens that can affect humans. We are aware that in crop residues, you can have pathogens that would have affected the crop also being present. And in truth, when you have materials that consist of these pathogens, it takes a little bit more diligence, a more direct intervention in terms of managing your compost, in terms of managing your waste. And outside of temperature, as we mentioned, that the heat does help to reduce the pathogen load. Sometimes it doesn't eliminate it, but what it really does is that it reduces it to a threshold that is not considered harmful, such as the fecal coliform. But remember, I spoke about the microbes and the importance of the microbes. And so what is happening in this composting process is that there's a shift from opportunistic towards beneficial microbes. And these beneficial microbes can suppress some of these harmful pathogens within the composting process. And I'll explain very briefly how they can do that. One of the first methods is that some of these microbes produce antibiotics. And I want you to think about, for example, penicillin that you sometimes get as an antibiotic when you have a cold, a bacterial cold or whatever. That comes from a fungus, Penicillium. And so that fungus really and truly is producing an antibiotic that is killing the microorganism that is making you sick. And similarly in the compost, some of these bacteria or some of these microbes produce some of these antibiotic or these compounds that can suppress the pathogens. Secondly, is that these beneficial microbes outcompete the what you call the harmful microorganisms or pathogens for food. They compete for nutrients. And so if you have many of the beneficial microorganisms present, what they will do is that they will outcompete and rob the pathogen of nutrients that it requires to grow, because similar to how the beneficial requires carbon, nitrogen, other nutrients for growth, the pathogens also require that, right? And the last one that I'll speak about, it is known as parasitism or predation. And how I want you to think about that one is basically think about your fungus or think about a microorganism that basically has the ability to produce something, an enzyme that breaks open the surface of the microorganism. So think about acid going on the skin, for example, and that burning and releasing obviously substance. And similarly, these fungus and these things that parasite or predate, they have certain compounds that opens the structure of the pathogen and kills it. So these are just three main ways. And so I want you to bear in mind that it's not only the heat that helps in terms of pathogen reduction, but also the beneficial microbes and that shift into beneficial microbes that also help in terms of reducing the pathogen load in the compost.
Thank you, Bryan. And the second question, Mario, if you want to take it, how often do you have to do a test pile as it relates to added material?
Well, normally I would do it throughout the life cycle of the composting process. So with that in mind, you know if the composting pile is functioning as it should. So one of the tests I would do is the moisture test, like Bryan mentioned. You squeeze it to see how much moisture is there, and if there's not enough, you have to add moisture, add some water. The smell test, to smell if at all it's still releasing sulfur or ammonia, which means you need to put more, you have to do more mixing to get oxygen in. You also look at the other organisms around, such as what you would call like maggots, to see if there's a large portion of maggots still existing around the pile. So you know that the pile is still too wet in some regards, not enough oxygen as well. You look at the structure of the pile to see if it's flattening out in terms of it's compacting. So probably it means you may need to add a bigger particle size material. So what I would do, I would add something that is as long as about 6, 7, 8 inches long, and have it integrated into the pile. So you create this kind of structure that lifts the pile and create these pockets for air to pass through. Along with that, it depends on that material too. That would carry some nutrient value, like depending on if you're using neem branches from a neem tree or as such, moringa, these different materials that they talk about nutrients and nitrogen and stuff like that. They add to your pile as well. So throughout the life cycle of the pile, you have to do a lot of monitoring. What they also have to do is have a record keeping system, a notebook, and you record the temperatures, you record how often you turn it, you write some observational notes, and then every time you visit the pile, you refer to those things to see if there's improvements or there's challenges, and based on that, you deal with it accordingly.
Okay, thank you, Bryan. So as time is coming upon us, what we will do, we'll take the questions from the hands that are raised. We will go with St. Vincent,
and you have to,
St. Vincent, then followed by Uvilla. St. Vincent, go ahead.
Hello, are you hearing us?
Yes, I could hear you. Go ahead.
Given the increase in the cost of chemical fertilizer, composting now has to be taken from just a theory to actual practice. We have to implement it. Do you have any experiences of muted, thank God. Either the Caribbean or any other developing countries coming together and getting things done? And if so, could ICA be of help to us as small farmers in getting this job done?
Okay. Maria, you want to take the first part of that question?
I didn't hear it properly, sorry.
I believe he was asking if there is the making of the compost collectively in the Caribbean. If you have any experience with that.
Caribbean or any developing country. And the second part of the question is that could IECA facilitate such a process? Because you have to think about buying equipment to monitor and so on. So rather than it being done on a single farmer basis, we could consider it as a group project with all the farmers located in one area.
All right, I understand. That is something we have been exploring here in Trinidad for a number of years. Yes. As I was saying, that's an idea we have been exploring in Trinidad for a number of years. We're still exploring it, making some little advancement. So what you're describing more or less is something like a centralized location where the entire composting process takes place and the end product distribution happens at the same time. And you have a network of farmers who contribute to this process. So that is something that could be designed. What has to come into play is an audit of all the participants, and what are the feedstock materials that each participant can contribute, and what are the logistics required that would have little carbon footprint in terms of moving materials from one place to the next, or if it means having a decentralized operation where specific farms or farmers are identified based on their feedstock load and other things, and they are presented with certain technologies and support systems, and they become like the main outlet for processing and have a distribution network so other farmers could get access to the material. What I can say is that the first step is to meet with farmers on the ground, like yourself, and introduce each farmer to the system, and then they can say how best they can contribute to the system or the design of the system. And this system now would incorporate an integrated operation which facilitates their needs, but not at the same time taken away from their operation with their farm. Also, there are certain technologies, basic technologies we will require, like a shredder, chipper, and some other things, and some basic tools like what Bryan had mentioned to measure what have you. So we know what the end product is, and we need to know from each farmer what end product that they're looking for. Now, with composting, end products can start as early as 3 weeks into 3 months. So if a farmer has soil problems and we identify what those problems are, we can decide how best we can develop our product to treat with that farmer's problem. So it's not just about making a finished compost. If somebody is very involved in nursery production and we understand the kind of plants that they're producing, we can develop materials, inputs specific to that person. So there are a wide range of end products that can produce from as early as 3 weeks into 3 months.
Thank you, Mario. In terms of ICA's involvement there, a lot of ICA's mandates is through the Ministries of Agriculture, and a lot of these are executed through projects, and as such, these sort of requests and so on would need to come from the Ministries of Agriculture in the various ICA representative countries. It's not a matter of ICA just coming in and decide this or that should be done. It has to be triggered by the countries. Thanks. We will go to you, Vila, for your question there. Are you still with us, Uvila? Onisia, are you still there? You could.
I'm muted.
Okay, Uvila is on. Okay.
Yeah.
Uvila, go ahead.
Good morning to all. Is there such a thing as an open compost? By this, I mean, you have a lot of leaves. It's the dry season. Well, in the dry season, we find a lot of leaves all over the place. Now you rake it up to one point, you gather all together and leave it there for a while. Of course, you don't only have dry leaves, but you also have the nitrogenous parts of the compost. Now, would you consider that a type of compost? Because when the leaves decay, we get some manure, don't we? Does that make sense?
Question, Yuvila, I'll ask one of them to answer that for you.
Okay.
Any of you could take it.
All right. So yes, Yuvila. So what you are getting is material that is being broken down and stabilized somewhat. And you know, I want us to bear in mind what Mario just said a while ago in terms of the end use. I think that is very important for us to understand. And so what we're saying is that we might have what you have done a while ago, and we might get, you know, something that looks dirt-like and would have been broken down, and it can be applied to the soil or to the garden, but might not necessarily be the best thing for a seedling starter, if you get where I'm coming from.
Understood, yeah.
And so, again, remember, composting is borrowing from nature's process. And nature naturally, especially the soil, helps in terms of recycling waste. All compost is doing is just adding a little bit of control or order or discipline to the process then rather, so that we can be certain that what we get out of it is for a particular end use or can be utilized for a particular end use. I hope that shed a little light, Yuvila. If I didn't, I can clarify.
Certainly, certainly.
All right, no problem.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we will take Onisia. Thank you for your question, Yuvila.
Welcome.
Yes, good morning. I'm glad that Mr. Smith answered the first question that you read about the seedless composting. But I was wondering if you guys have any experience with using the vetiver grass, which is actually seedless, to use in compost, or if is it recommended to be used in a compost. And the other question is that you guys early on spoke about ratio, and my question is similar to that of Yuvila, is that, you know, you are a household or you're a farmer and you just gather a bunch of things and you just put it together in a pile, sticks, manure, leaves, a bunch of stuff. How important is the ratio in making sure that we get composted? My questions are understood.
All right, yeah, I'll try and answer it from my practical experience. You are right. Well, the first thing you ask if you can use vetiver, you can use, well, my experience, I use any grass, seeds or seedless, you don't matter, but it all has to do with the preparation of the material, the mixing of the material. Like, I don't know if you're familiar when people doing construction and they mix cement, you need to know how much water to add to the cement so you could get the mix that is appropriate for laying bricks or doing a floor and spreading a wall or what have you. And the same thing with the material. You have to know from beforehand what you want to use the material for at the end. Use the compost for at the end. So in the processing part, whatever material you use, you need to have the proper conditions that will deal with the pathogens, deal with the seeds, and all those other negative things that you don't want to happen. So I wouldn't be too concerned about the material, but I would be quite meticulous about the preparation of the material. The other question is based on the ratio. Well, I don't go out to the field with a scale or measuring tape or anything as such. I think over time, you have an intuitive understanding of the material and the scale and the size and measurements. Probably like when you do cooking. I sure you don't always use a measuring cup when you have to do your cooking. So with compost, your skill set is really observation, real good observation. So when you're looking at something, you could discern if it's working or not. And while figuring out those things, you can then decide what is the best approach to solve it. So how I would deal with ratio is that I know every time I make a pile, I must have most time more carbon material than wet material or nitrogen material. I compost food waste, and food waste is over 90% wet material, right? It's very difficult to handle, very, very difficult to handle. If you don't know what you're doing, you can get in real problems. For example, we collect pawpaw from a company that makes frozen pawpaws and pineapples, right? We present them with the bin, they fill the bin. There's a schedule for the pickup, but they would never meet the schedule because they're busy doing other things. So I may get that bin a week or 2 weeks after. So what do you think happens to that pawpaw or pineapple in that bin? It turns into water, twice the weight it's supposed to be. So we have to take that now and float it into a compost pile and figure out the ratio. Now, I don't have a scale. I don't have a measuring cup or anything, but I do know whatever I add into that pile to deal with that waste material, it has to be umpteen times more to dry out or suck up all that liquid, then combine that material in such a way that you hardly see any liquid running through your hands, and then you begin to realize the moisture is getting under control, while at the same time you're looking for that fluffiness. When you mix the material, it don't feel like sludge in your hand. It starts to feel fluffy, like what Bryan mentioned, you know. So the density of the material becomes lighter and lighter, and then you realize, yes, something is working here. So while you continuously mix in, you add in material to suck up the liquid, you add in material to give the oxygen, like particle size and what have you. So a lot of observation over time, you have to develop that skill so that you don't have to be second guessing yourself when you build a pile. I'm not saying it's going to happen immediately, but it takes practice.
Okay, thank you,
Thank you.
Mario.
Thank you.
We'll take Dr. Evelyn. Are you there with us, Dr. Evelyn? If not, we'll move on to Anja. Go ahead, Anja.
Hi, my name is Anya.
Anya, apologies.
No problem. I was wondering if there were any recommendations in the interim before getting equipment such as grinders or anything that chippers. Are there recommendations for larger pieces like mango seeds and sticks?
Do you want to take this one, Bryan? That's it. That's the question, Anya?
Well, that's part A of the question. Just recommendations for things that will not fit into the size specifications suggested.
Okay. And the part 2 of the question is, so they could just take it one time.
Mario suggested to turn the pile once a week to allow for the natural process to happen. If you're using a sealed container, is that enough time for adequate aeration of your pile?
Okay, so Bryan, you take the first, and Mario, you take the second. Thanks, Anya.
All right, so Anya, what I would say is that when you're introducing materials like, for example, the mango seed or the branches to the composting pile, what you're really introducing is materials that have a high lignin content. And let me explain what I mean by a high lignin content. And not saying that they cannot be introduced to the pile, but these materials are generally hard to break down. And so because they're very hard to break down, what you might find happening, depending on the other materials that you would have mixed with the pile, is that at the end of the composting process, you might realize that everything else is broken down. And even if you would have chipped some of these, very thick stems, etc., you realize that it's still present as a solid object, without showing any signs of decomposition in the mixture. And we can think about, for example, when leaves fall on the ground, right, in comparison to when the bark or the stem of a big tree, it falls on the ground. The stem will degrade, but it will degrade over time, over a very long period of time in comparison to the leaves and the smaller twigs. And so that is a consideration that you have to think about again in terms of the end use of your compost. And the fact that when you introduce these materials and what you're mixing them with, you might have that challenge in terms of those materials not being broken down adequately or properly, right? In terms of dealing with the stems and these heavy stems, really and truly, you would really want a grinder. It's not like, for example, leaves or grasses or something like that, that you can probably use, a weed whacker or something, that can easily break them up because the tissue or the material is a bit softer. And so in terms of ease of processing, that is what you would really want. And, there's all this old fashioned way of breaking them up manually, but that will take some time. I hope
Okay,
that answered you.
sorry, I probably should have given a bit more background. So if you have a considerable volume of a material, would, in terms of part of your, what would you say that, your grading process, would you suggest to put things like mango seeds in through the process and take them out later so that you mitigate pest infestation? And then other materials like sticks, would you just recommend, if you don't have a chipper at this point in time, just stacking them in piles for natural decomposition?
Definitely. And so depending on the size of the sticks or the wood, they can also, be looked at in terms of bulking, and creating pore spaces in the material, depending on what you're mixing. As it regards the mango seed, you said take it out, pathogen. What exactly?
Sorry,
do you mean?
I mean, put it through the pile. So even though it doesn't break down during the process, any of the sugars are surrounding the seed. So if you're doing agro-processing and you're left with the skins and the seed, could it still, even though we know that there's a significant chance that it will remain intact at the end, at least any of the flesh surrounding the seed could still decompose and go into the composting, and then you could have a sieving process to extract the seeds after the pile has matured?
Definitely. I think you answered it right there. The flesh or the surrounding flesh outside of the seed would have soluble sugars that the microbes would love, as well as nitrogen, and definitely would add to that nutrient balance that the microbes would need to break down the material. And so, yes, they would utilize the flesh, and then you can, if it's a case where the larger seed is remaining, obviously because it's more tougher or difficult to break down, that can be sieved post-production in terms of, sieving your material to ensure you have good quality, good grade, etc. So yes, Anya.
Thanks, Brian. I will ask Dr. St. Martin to just add a bit there for us. Go ahead, Johnny.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, colleagues, I think the discussion is very rich, and I trust persons are getting the information that they require. One of the things I wanted to perhaps zone on, and I think that is very useful, is the issue of, I keep on hearing it in terms of the natural degradation and also composting. And I think Brian made the point very earlier on when he distinguished between composting as a managed process and also the natural decomposition. Let me say very clearly here that there's nothing wrong with allowing the natural decomposition. I saw some comments in the chat saying that the forest is the best compost, but very technically, most times the decomposition that you're achieving in the forest, although useful, it is not considered composting. It is still considered degradation, which you are at the end point. Brian mentioned something like stabilization, but what you're really looking at is the humic, or what you call that kind of earthy material here, which both of the processes could give you. They could give you that earthy looking like rich brown material, the humic acids, if you want to get very technical, etc. But the main difference is, if you are a person and you want it at a certain time, you want to fast forward it, you want to have it at a shorter time, that you cannot wait until the forest does its natural thing. And even sometimes when the forest does its natural thing, in terms of the usefulness of it, it is useful by a certain time. So I want to distinguish here that, say, one, that you could actually use some of the waste that you generate in some circumstances one time, like the banana peel, etc. Not always need to actually be composted. In addition, you could pile up your waste brown material and wait for about a year to get that solid decomposition. Or you could also put in a composting system where the control allows you in some aspect to not only speed up the process, but try to get a consistent quality product here. And so therefore you have to, this is where we are going at. We are saying categorically, if you want a composting at a certain time, at a consistent quality, etc., this is what this is about. How do you manage and build your compost? It is not about saying that the degradation cannot happen naturally and it is useful. But if you have to wait for example, the big size of the logs to decompose, imagine that versus how long it will take a twig to decompose. And so these things will decompose no matter the size here, but the speed of the decomposition vis-a-vis how soon that you want to benefit from the process is really the thing that we are hitting at, to be very clear here. So I just wanted to clarify that as we go about. So even the issue of the particle size, yes, you could actually have longer twigs, etc. But if you want it within a certain time, you could chip up the material, or you could reduce the size so that you have a faster process. So I hope that this is very clear as we go in forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Chani. We answered both of your questions, right, Anya?
Well, there's a question she did
Yes,
ask
Mario, go ahead.
concerning, well, first I would like to find out from what kind of composting system are you currently working with?
I haven't done any practical experiments just yet. I'm literally starting to accumulate material this week. But it will be in a plastic barrel to start.
Oh, so you're using a rotary drum system where you put in stuff in a barrel and turn it?
Yeah.
Okay, because we didn't cover any discussions really around that in detail. But is that system, are you using it as a hot composting system or a vermicomposting system? You decide yet?
Sorry, Mario, sorry to interrupt, but just for the interest of time, is it okay if we just share the contact information and we could provide some more in-depth details on that process?
Thank you.
Okay, all right, well, I would just say it all depends, like we all discussed, the material, particles, all this type of thing, and the system, and every system come with its benefits and its drawbacks. That's why we're not getting to a lot of other systems at the moment. But I can tell you with the, if you're doing the hot composting system in the barrel, that will require more feedstock preparation because of the scale of the barrel and of what you would want to happen in the barrel. So you would have to invest in getting those materials at different particle size.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Evelyn will take your question now.
She asked to be unmuted. She's not able to unmute herself.
Okay, so I don't seem to be getting any of the persons. Dr. Evelyn, I am asking you to unmute, but however, I am not hearing you. So in that regard, can you please type your question? And we will start the wrap up. So just before we close, can I just ask Bryan and also Mario to just highlight one key thing that each of them would like to you, the participants, to take away from this. And in the meantime, I will be executing a feedback poll on the screen that you could answer. So Mario, if you want to go ahead first. Michael, are you still there?
Good morning, Akila. Yes, I'm still here.
Yes, Michael, go ahead.
Yes, good morning. I just wanted to provide a very quick response to the question from St. Vincent. Just if you could just give me 1 minute, just to let the person know that yes, we are actually providing assistance in this area already, and practical assistance as well too. Last year, we would have provided some assistance in the Ministry of Agriculture in the form of a heavy-duty shredder and small pieces of equipment, moisture meters and thermometers and support to assist their own compost training unit. In addition to that, we have been working with some farmers organizations. Actually, one of them in the Southeast, we have worked with them to formulate a project which has been financed by the New Zealand High Commission, and that will result in the establishment of some compost sheds for some farmers in that organization, as well as providing some of the equipment like shredders and weed whackers that Mario would have spoken to that would be necessary for composting. And all of these things are revolving around a bigger issue for that organization, where we are actually consistent in the production of sweet corn for the local market. And we were wanting to ensure that the plants themselves after harvesting, that we were getting them back into the production process. And so we are looking at a system where we will be composting those corn plants. So that is actually something that is about to happen with the funding from the New Zealand High Commission out of Barbados. And similarly, we have been working with the FAO and the Ministry of Agriculture. Actually, now we have just finished the establishment of a compost shed in Richmond Vale, up in the northwest of St. Vincent, and that is a model to be used for the training of farmers, because we are starting a process here now for the training of 60 farmers or so in a number of different production practices, one of which would be composting. So there are things happening. I would suggest that you can get in touch with the office and we can speak more as to what are the possibilities for the development of other initiatives in other areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much there, Michael. And if we have any of the ICA representatives present, you could also jump in and provide some added information there. And also, Chani, if you want to provide any additional information as it regards to ICA's involvement in the composting area.
Yeah, no problem, Nikki. I'll take that opportunity. Just to say that if you look on YouTube and also Google, you would see some of the practices or some of the sessions that we would have been we would have made. There's, I think, a 1 hour session, more than 1 hour, with a session that was done in the Bahamas by Dr. Ambimbola, who was formerly with ICA. He just retired. And so there is material there that not only deals with composting, but also the entire waste management process. And also some of the national technicians in the countries where ICA has an office, they have also undergone waste management training with a specific focus on compost. ICA is also developing relationship with the certifying organization, or the Composting Association of Canada, in terms of trying to get quality compost. So I would just encourage the participants. Some persons here probably would have participated in previous iterations of the composting process. We have been doing it for some time and we will continue doing it. We are always amazed when we still get a lot of persons interested and signing up for material on that. But I encourage you to contact the local offices and the national offices, national offices, as well as to Google it online through YouTube to get some of the sessions that we would have had in the past that goes into greater details as we move along. So with that, I say thank you. Back to you, Nigeria.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. St. Martin. We have the ICA website as Dr. St. Martin, and we also have a lot of stuff on YouTube there that you can also look at. and some additional information will be shared with you via email. All of the PowerPoints today will be also shared with you. And just before you leave, we have the second forum coming up. And so I will just share that with you, as well as the link for persons who are interested. So the second forum, as I mentioned at the beginning of the session, we will look at efficient low-cost irrigation and water-saving techniques for increasing crop production. Let me just place the link in the chat. I will also send this via email for persons. So I have included it in the chat, and you could register using the link. Just before we close, Bryan, if you could just come in and give one key thing that you want the participants to leave with, and you as well, Mario, if you want to jump in and just give one key thing that you want the participants to leave with as it relates to composting.
I think it has been echoed several times, Michaela, and that is composting borrows from natural decomposition. And really what it does is that it presents a better guide for what the end product or the end use that you so desire. And it also speaks to timeliness in terms of getting that stable organic product that you want to use in your farming activities. So that's what I want to leave the participants with.
Thank you, Bryan. And Mario?
I want you all to leave with believing that we can make our own agricultural inputs from the resources that exist right here in all the islands. What we require is greater attention and experimentation.
Thank you for that, Bryan. And I just want to say special thank you to all of you who have participated here today. I do hope that the information is very relevant to you and will be applicable to you. And I thank you and do wish each and every one of you a pleasant afternoon and productive balance of the week ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you.